Getting into chapter 3, and this is the section 1. We're going to start talking about the Civil War. We're going to start leading up to it. So, while we're talking about this, what I want you guys to start thinking about here is some of these main points. We're going to discuss the attempts made to compromise with the secessionists. We're going to analyze how the fall of Fort Sumter affected the relationship between the Union and the Confederacy. We're going to identify the advantages each side posed at the beginning of the war. And then we're going to summarize the consequences of the First Battle of Bull Run. Now, assuming that you guys did your reading, you should have a pretty good idea of what's going on here as we go through the discussion. And what I want you to do for food for thought here, I want you to understand that Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union, okay? He wanted to abolish slavery. And there's a few other things going on here, but for the content area, I want you to just realize that he wants, the main reason here is he wants slavery gone. And he didn't want to allow the expansion of slavery. And there were still 8 northern slave states at this time in the Union. Okay, so that creates a little friction here. Lincoln doesn't want slavery, but he still got slave states in the Union. He's trying to find a peace to keep those guys from succeeding in the Union, okay? After Lincoln was elected, South Carolina voted to succeed the Union because Lincoln aimed to abolish slavery. So the other thing you got to realize too here is the southern states wanted slavery because that's how they made their money. They're getting free labor from these guys. They're out picking cotton and they don't have to pay them. All right, I think I jumped a slide or 2. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Union dissolving. Abraham Lincoln first took office in 1861. Okay, so we talked about how after he was elected, South Carolina was the first one to say no. We don't want this. We want slavery. They're succeeding. After that, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union, and so he made it unconstitutional for any southern state, for any state to succeed. It was unconstitutional. That caused a lot of friction between the North and the South. All right, so then we're going to talk about Fort Sumter and the importance it had. Meeting little resistance, the Confederacy took over many federal forts. One fort that was very important to the South was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter lied in South Carolina, and it had a lot of the supplies. It was one of the only last forts that the Union still had that was still under federal control, that was still in the South. Lincoln got word that Fort Sumter had been running low on supplies, and if not refurbished, would fall to the Confederacy. The North didn't want to lose Fort Sumter. It would be a sign that Lincoln could not protect federal property in the seceded states. So Lincoln sent an unarmed ship with supplies to Fort Sumter. He sent these ships only carrying supplies. He didn't send them with troops or anything because he didn't want to. His idea was if he sent a ship over to resupply Fort Sumter, that if the Confederacy attacked these ships, these unarmed ships, that the Confederacy would be the aggressors. So then that would kind of he was hoping that the other states, the states that we're talking about, those 8 slave states, he didn't want them to have any reason to succeed. So if the Confederacy was the aggressor, he was hoping that would kind of shift things and he wouldn't have to worry about that. All right. So Lincoln sent warnings to the South Carolina governor that he was supplying these ships and they were on their way. But the ships only had supplies. They didn't have troops or no arms. So he was making that very clear to the governor. Governor Pickens relayed this message to General Brugard, who ordered the federal troops to evacuate the fort. Anderson, who was the commander of the Fort Sumter for the federal, he refused. They weren't going to back down. On April 12th, the Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. On April 13th, 1861, Anderson, after 34 hours of fighting, Anderson finally formally surrendered Fort Sumter. On April 15th, Lincoln publicly announced that the rebellion too powerful to be stopped by ordinary judicial proceedings. He called for the states to provide 75,000 troops to put down their uprising. So, it did exactly what Lincoln thought it was going to do. The Confederacy attacked the ships, they attacked Fort Sumter, now the Confederacy is the aggressor. So his plan's working so far, but unfortunately, that caused a little rough edges for those states that didn't agree with this, those 8 slave states. So what was the significance of Fort Sumter? Well, it led Lincoln to call troops into war and led 4 more southern states to succeed: North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Virginia. And this was the first real battle that led to the Civil War in the United States. This was it. This is what caused it. So that's a big thing. I want you guys to start thinking about that for our assignment that we have coming up. So we're going to talk a little bit about the advantages that each side had. Like I said, we're going to discuss our main points. So the North had more than 22 million residents. They had a huge population advantage. So that obviously means they have more troops, have more supplies, they have more people they can call in the battle. The South only had 9 million residents, and 3.5 of those millions were slaves. And they couldn't just say, okay, we're going to stop all of our production, and we're going to send these slaves in the war, these untrained slaves that most of them can't even speak English. We can't just send them in the war. So they had a very few population to send into war. The North had a stronger economic advantage. They controlled over 85% of the nation's industry and materials and resources. So they have an advantage because now they can resupply their weapons. They can resupply the things that they need a lot faster. Their economy's a lot better. The North controlled most of the railroads. Because the majority of them were located in the Northeast and Midwest, this allowed them to move troops much more efficiently. So it's pretty self-explanatory there. They controlled the railroads. They were in the majority of the railroads ran right through the North. So when they needed to go somewhere, they had that at their beliefs. They had it. And the U.S. Navy stayed loyal to the Union. The South, they had to start a Navy, and they had to start it from scratch. But because they had to start from scratch, they had really 2 big advantages over the North. The Confederacy only had to fight in defensive war, trying to protect their territory. And as we talked about, they had to start their Navy from scratch. Well, they had excellent military leadership. A name that should pop out is Robert E. Lee. He was a general for the South. He was very educated. He went through a war academy. He fought in some very successful battles, as you should have read in chapters before. You guys should know who Robert E. Lee is. All right, now we're going to talk about the first Battle of Bull Run. So Lincoln ordered some 35,000 barely trained troops to Richmond, Virginia in July of 1861. Now after the Battle of Fort Sumter, they realized that this war, there was more things, so they decided they were going to have to train their troops a little more, in depth. But Lincoln decided that he wasn't going to do that. He was going to send 35,000 trained, barely untrained troops. Whoops. And on their way to Richmond, Virginia, they were met by the Confederacy 30 miles outside of Washington at a junction named Bull Run. So the Confederacy knew, Confederacy caught word somehow that they were coming, so they met them there. They weren't going to let them meet them in Richmond. Richmond was the capital for the Confederacy, and they weren't going to fight in their capital ground. The battle was the first begin of the favor of the North. But the Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson soon stopped the Union assault and forced the Union troops retreating back to Washington. The battle made the nation realize that the war was not soon to be short over. It was going to be a long, hard battle, and both sides began to seriously train their troops with war strategy. So the most important effect of Bull Run was defeat over the North. The North had all these advantages, and they thought they were going to come in and they were going to be, they thought it was just going to be a quick, swift blow. The North was going to come in, they were going to win. They had economic power. They had, like we discussed, they had more troops. They had a bigger population. And the South was, they had military advantages. They had better trained generals. And so, as you can see, that kind of played a big part for them. The other big, real significance that it had was that they knew that this war wasn't over. It was going to go long. This was another real battle that set forth for the Civil War. So for your guys' assignment, what I want you to do is kind of start thinking about what it was for the life of a soldier in the Civil War, some of the battles and some of the things that they had to face. And we'll go ahead. I want you to think about what side you would have been fighting on and what beliefs you believed in. And I want you to discuss the difficulties they faced on and off the battlefield. And this is the topics of Section 1. We'll get to work. Thanks.